our goal with Black Hat Bash is to get somebody from zero shell scripting knowledge to I know how to put together scripts that can talk to one another, pipe text from one to another, or orchestrate tools to produce one result that is a compilation of multiple tools. And that's what our goal is in this book, along with the hacking stuff and exploiting vulnerable services and so on.
And we really wanted to write Black Hat Bash to teach hackers how to live off of the land. And for folks who may not know what living off the land is, it's a type of technique for operating as a hacker within an environment that might be restricted, that does not involve the use of tools, because either you're in a restricted environment or the tools themselves are not going to work within whatever environment you're in. And you have to learn how to use the binaries that are on the actual endpoint itself and use Bash to sort of glue all of this together into a sweet little automated script that'll do things like reconnaissance, lateral movement, privilege escalation, defense evasion. And I think that's what sets apart some of the junior hackers from some of the great hackers, or those who can really operate in a very limited environment with something like Bash.
Specifically, WordPress is interesting because a plugin that can impact the core of WordPress is usually an interesting vulnerability. Still denial of service, but it's very effective. But what's interesting about GraphQL is that you have more than one way to DOS a server and take it down.
As I've said many times in the past, if you want to learn to code, I recommend that you start by learning Python. So many people that I've interviewed have also recommended that you start with Python.
Python. It would be Python.
It doesn't matter if you want to learn about AI or become an ethical hacker or a developer or a network engineer, or what about a cybersecurity expert, you need to learn Python. And a great way to start your programming journey is the Programming with Python course from Brilliant. This is a great course for both beginners as well as those who want to refresh their skills. This course helps you become proficient in the world's most popular programming language, which again is Python. Your programming journey starts with the basics, like printing text to the screen. And what I love about Brilliant's courses is that it's very interactive and shows you right from the beginning what happens when you introduce errors in your code. The course then transitions into you writing your very first Python scripts. You'll learn about numbers, variables, and type conversions in Python. This sets the foundation for the coding challenges that come later in the course. As you progress through the course, you'll delve into loops, solving the intriguing Fibonacci challenge, and navigate through conditionals with the collapse challenge. But if you're more creatively inclined, you'll learn to draw in Python and turn your code into visual art. Brilliant's curriculum is designed to build your confidence and skills step by step. You'll explore the power of built-in functions, learn the secrets of for loops, delve into string functions, substrings, and the versatile replace function. Each lesson is a building block that helps you become more proficient in Python. By the end of your learning journey, you'll be crafting custom functions, utilizing the range function, and enhancing your code with functions that use arguments. This course is more than just learning the mechanics of Python. It helps you develop a passion for programming, problem solving, and innovation. You can sign up today at brilliant.org/David Bombal and start your journey into the world of Python programming. Don't just learn to code. Code to learn, create, and solve problems. Your future in programming begins now. Use the link below to sign up. I really want to thank Brilliant for providing not only fantastic courses, but also for supporting my channel and helping me help you learn more about cybersecurity, networking, programming, and AI. Hey everyone, it's David Bombal back with two very special guests, Dolev and Nick. Welcome.
Hey David, thank you so much for having us.
Hey David, thank you.
Guys, really excited to have you here. You are busy writing this book, so I've got like a pre-release, Black Hat Bash. Really excited about this. This one I didn't know so much about, Black Hat GraphQL. This has been out for a while now, but perhaps you guys can tell me, writing books, I'm sure it takes about 5 minutes, right? Writing books is hard. This is why I don't do it. Tell us about the journey, or how did it come about that you guys wrote these two books?
So for me, writing a book was always some kind of a goal that I wanted to achieve, and I never really knew if I will ever be able to write one, and about what. There's like so many books on so many topics, and I was always under the impression that writing a book requires like so much research and understanding of the topic, and just that alone is hard. Then you have the actual writing, which is another difficult aspect as well. And I always wanted to write a book, to be honest, and I wasn't exactly sure on what specifically. And both Nick and I, we worked at a fintech company that is heavily invested in GraphQL. GraphQL is an API technology, like essentially like an alternative to REST APIs. And we got a lot of exposure there from a security perspective to what GraphQL is, how to defend it, how can it be attacked, as an example. And at some point, we developed some tools, developed some learning platforms for GraphQL. And I thought at that point that, we accumulated so much knowledge and tools, perhaps it's a good baseline for writing a book. And at the time, there was no hacking book or any security book on GraphQL. All the GraphQL books were around like learning GraphQL. For example, full stack development with GraphQL, getting started with GraphQL, things like that. But nothing on security. And I was like, hey, let's write a GraphQL security book. At the time, it was like an idea where we can write a book about attacking and defending GraphQL. And I pitched the idea to Nick. Hey, you want to team up and write a book together? We've never done that before, and we reached out to No Starch with the idea. We put together a proposal. Initially, it was a book about, like I said, attacking and defending GraphQL, and then after some conversations with No Starch, they wanted to focus the book on the pen testing side, and then it became
good choice. Well done, Bo. Sorry, what?
And then it became, initially it was, I think, offensive GraphQL or something like that. And then it changed to Black Hat GraphQL. When we realized that we're going to be focusing on the red team aspect of it. We put together a good proposal, which served as the blueprint for the actual book eventually. And we got the contract and started writing.
I love it. I mean, I was going to say, we were talking offline, what I really love about both your books, and just for everyone who's watching, we're going to cover Bash and GraphQL, but this is the lab for Bash. I love what you guys have done. It's really practical, right? I love that style of learning. And Nick, you were telling me offline that that's the kind of way you learn, I think?
Yeah, for sure. Taking things apart and figuring out how it works, I think that's the essence of true hacking. And in both books, Black Hat GraphQL and Black Hat Bash, we've curated a lab environment that's intentionally vulnerable. With damn vulnerable GraphQL application, we've built in a number of attack scenarios and walk the users through ways in which they can actually penetrate into the API and steal information from the API, cause it to crash, and a number of other different attack scenarios. With Black Hat Bash, the story of how we sort of came across writing this book is, in the midst of writing Black Hat GraphQL, we get an email while we're at the Sector Toronto Security Conference, and Dolev and I are sitting right next to each other, and it's an email from No Starch saying, "Hey, do you guys know of anyone who'd be interested in writing a hacking book on about Bash and Bash scripting?" And Dolev and I just looked at each other and we said, "We got this. Let's put in a proposal." And then we got the green light to write the Black Hat Bash book. And we wanted to take the exact same approach. We wanted to give folks really hands-on hacking environment based out of Docker, where we've got two different networks, sort of an internal network and then more of like a publicly exposed network. The lab environment is based off of like an Acme hosting company. So they've got like some of their hosting customer websites that you can try to break into using some of the Bash techniques that we described in the book. And then from there, laterally move into some of the more internal, juicy parts of this hosting company.
I love it. I mean, I think for a lot of people who want to study, it's much more fun to do the offensive side. So I'm glad that that's what you focused on rather than defensive. I mean, if you can see the problems, then it like makes you wake up to, why it needs to be protected, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think the other things that we want to sort of talk about is when it comes to offensive security, we find that a lot of hackers these days are very tool-centric. They like to bring their tools everywhere that they go, and some of these tools are very large, they're very loud, they're very clunky, and we really wanted to write Black Hat Bash to teach hackers how to live off of the land. And for folks who may not know what living off the land is, it's a type of technique for operating as a hacker within an environment that might be restricted, that does not involve the use of tools, because either you're in a restricted environment, or the tools themselves are not going to work within whatever environment you're in. And you have to learn how to use the binaries that are on the actual endpoint itself, and use bash to sort of glue all of this together into a sweet little automated script that will do things like reconnaissance, lateral movement, privilege escalation, defense evasion. And I think that's what sets apart some of the junior hackers from some of the great hackers, are those who can really operate in a very limited environment with something like bash.
I really want to get into the book, but before we do that, can you tell us more about the experience of writing the book?
Yeah, for me, there are a couple of challenges with writing a book. You don't know who's going to be reading it. You have people who are just starting, in the field. You have seasoned developers, seasoned engineers in general, security engineers. So you kind of have to tailor the content to all of them, which is a very difficult task. And you also have to, when you build a lab, you have to keep in mind that you may have people that have slower computers, and you want to make sure that they're also included and can actually participate in building that lab, and tailor the lab in a way, or build a lab in a way that doesn't break. Technologies change, tools change, installation procedures change. So for us to build something that is going to have a pretty long life is something that we had to design and keep that in mind. From building the lab automatically to testing it, to reporting it to us if something breaks in the process, just like any software development process basically needs to be. So writing it also is challenging in the sense that you have to keep in mind that when tools change, some tools may just disappear. For example, from GitHub, we had that case. Exactly. We had a tool that just was gone. I think it was Rapalizer or something, a well-known tool actually, just disappeared from GitHub, and we relied on it for certain parts of the book, not a big chunk of the book, so we could easily swap it. But that happens as well. So there's a lot of unpredictable things that happen that are outside of your control. Another thing that is important when writing a book is writing a book that will not go out of date quickly. Tools change,
especially technical books
get outdated or become outdated very, very quickly. I think with Bash, it's a little different because Bash has been around for such a long time, and it hasn't really changed that much. But the tools that we use there, they can change potentially. So we had to rely on tools that are, pretty mature, have been around for a while, as well as more like recent tools, because we don't want to only introduce tools that have been around for a while, right? The interesting thing about this book, and I was actually surprised when NoStart reached out to us about this book, because I know of a lot of Bash books, but there was, as far as I know, there's maybe one book from Pact, I believe, Pact Publishing, that is more on the offensive side using Bash, but it's pretty limited. And there aren't many security-oriented Bash programming books. And that actually surprised me. It was fun to have that opportunity to write such a book and have that be part of the Black Hat series of books, which I actually really like Black Hat Python, Black Hat Go. Always admired those kinds of books. And being able to introduce two more to this series, I think is a great opportunity. Definitely feeling blessed. But yeah, I mean, we had to build a lab that lasts for a while. Everybody can run. Doesn't require a lot of resources. Not overly complex, so things don't go wrong. And at the end of the day, when you build a lab, people are going to run into problems. So we also wanted to automate that part as efficiently as possible, so people can get up and running quickly. Although we do encourage people to install the lab step by step, so they actually know what they're doing or get insight into what the lab consists of, and that's also how they can practice their Bash. But yeah, it's a process. It's definitely a process, and just like any book, you will have people that are going to be satisfied with it. Some people may not necessarily be satisfied with it. People have different opinions, but at the end of the day, I think our goal with Black Hat Bash is to get somebody from zero shell scripting knowledge to I know how to put together scripts that can talk to one another, pipe text from one to another, or orchestrate tools to produce one result that is a compilation of multiple tools. And that's what our goal is in this book, along with the hacking stuff and exploiting vulnerable services and so on.
I think another thing that is really important for folks who are looking at writing a book themselves is working with the right teams, the right publisher.
Yeah.
Dolev and I have had the utmost honor to have Corey Ball, author of Hacking APIs, be our technical editor for Black Hat GraphQL. Corey is an absolute rock star and helped us really put quite the book out there for Black Hat GraphQL. And for Black Hat Bash, we are working with Casey Dauncey, a Toronto cybersecurity researcher and legend, and he has really helped us push the lab to be as tight and as crisp as possible for our readers and our users. So working with the right technical editors and also co-authors and publishers, these are all things that really folks need to take into consideration if they're looking at writing a book based off of their own research.
I remember when I reached out to Corey. So the funny story about Corey is that before we even had a contract for Black Hat GraphQL, Corey released his book, Hacking APIs. And Hacking APIs, I think one of the last chapters covers GraphQL. And he uses the then vulnerable GraphQL application as part of the lab. And he posted on LinkedIn, hey, my book is now out there. And I commented there like, hey, congratulations. And he put a comment there, totally not knowing that we were talking to No Starch at the same time. I will leave the GraphQL hacking book to you guys. And it was funny because I think those days were just, doing the entire contract work with No Starch to actually produce that book, and he didn't know. So it's funny looking at kind of thinking about it. And I remember that we wanted Corey to do the technical review, and he told me something along the lines of I'm not going to go easy on you. So my goal is to produce the best hacking book, not the one that goes out the fastest to the market. And I'm like, oh man, he's going to tear us apart. So, but he was great. And we're able to produce that book, and Corey really helped. His experience authoring a book was very good for us. And again, a book that discusses APIs in general, there couldn't be a better person to do that technical review for us other than Corey. So that was a funny story with Corey.
I love that. Nick, did you want to say more? You guys can just keep on talking. I wasn't going to throw questions at you.
No. I think when it comes to writing a book, the team is really really important. And then Dolev and I had a lot of back and forth where we really want to continue to raise the bar. I remember GraphQL has a lot of different elements to it, and there's this one sort of part of subscriptions, sort of the third core group of operations within GraphQL that's really not talked about or used. But I was talking to them we really need to build in some subscription support with DBGA and talk about it in the book. And Dolev was like, you know what, that's absolutely right. This would not be the GraphQL hacking book if we didn't include the subscriptions element. So I think being able to push each other and really put out the best possible effort on a hacking book is also super, super important. Having someone it's a good friend or a colleague or a co-researcher is a true honor to work on a timeless piece, not such a book.
I love it. I mean, the No Starch books are fantastic. They're great hacking books. I'm so glad that they have this whole part of proper hacking books to help people learn. Because some people, you learn from YouTube or you learn from videos, but I personally love reading books, and the books are fantastic.
It's funny. Before I wrote the book, I always told myself I have imposter syndrome. I always think that I'm not good enough, and I'm if I ever write a book and I actually manage to release it, that will take that whole imposter syndrome away. No. It actually gets worse. It doesn't get better. So for those who are listening, it's okay to have imposter syndrome. It actually makes you better, but it's not going to go away. It's part of the deal.
We didn't talk about your
Yeah.
experience, and let's raise it here, because how long you guys been doing this for?
Well, I'm in this space for like 14 years, I would say, 15 years at this point. GraphQL
And you still have
just more
imposter
like
syndrome.
recent years, 3 years. But Bash has been probably one of the first things I've learned when I started.
And Nick,
Yeah.
how long you been doing
And
it?
for myself, I've been hacking for over a decade. Some of the things that I've been really dabbling in is more of the physical lock picking, smart building, network, wireless, and just recently getting into API hacking as part of like GraphQL. In fact, my exposure to GraphQL was, as Joel mentioned, really limited before we really started to adopt it as part of the fintech that we both worked at. And I'd say one of the best ways to learn a technology is to agree to write a book about it. That's a really strong forcing function to get you to say, all right, you know what? Let's roll up our sleeves and let's write a book as we learn. And some of the chapters like the GraphQL attack surface, going into all the different nuances of the type of the types and the language inside of GraphQL, you're really going into how we've learned and uncovered all the nitty-gritty details about the GraphQL spec and have put that right there on paper for everyone to review. And when you take this sort of really almost like methodological approach to writing a book, you're also evaluating the technology itself from all these different angles. So we've broken out the book into 10 different chapters, and the chapter around authentication and authorization bypasses. That particular chapter, as we were writing it, we came up with the tool GraphQL as a result of literally learning about how implementations of GraphQL either get it right or get it wrong when it comes to implementing authentication and authorization. And GraphQL just sort of came out of the spur of us writing the book, where we found a way to use alias batching as a way to send a whole bunch of requests to a GraphQL API, where we can do things like stuffing OTP tokens or stuffing username and password combinations with just one HTTP request. So you can imagine, how powerful a tool like that is for pen testers. Yeah, I think that as you write a book, the level of depth that folks expect you to go into when you agree to write a book almost forces you to really look under every single rock, nook, and cranny for a vulnerability or a tool that will be really insightful for a penetration tester. We really wanted the book. I know Dolev is a different reader than I am. I'm more of a reference type reader, so I will go to a chapter when I need it, as I need it. And Dolev is more of like a cover to cover type reader. And so we hope that both books will satisfy both types of readers.
I'll also say that I think the nice thing and interesting thing about GraphQL space in general is it was untapped at the time that we started writing the book. If you look at like offensive security in general, there are tools for everything, multiple tools for everything, for pretty much every aspect. Port scanning, there's dozens of port scanning tools, web scraping, things like that. And in GraphQL, there weren't tools specifically for GraphQL, and some tools actually carry over or like transfer really well from like REST testing to GraphQL, but other tools not so much. GraphQL has a very unique way of communicating between a client and a server, so you have to make sure that the tools support that. And I remember some person reached out to me on LinkedIn asking me, hey, I have this GraphQL. Is there a way to know what GraphQL server implementation is behind a GraphQL API? I'm like, no, there is no way to know that. I mean, it's just an API. It will return whatever comes back, and that's it. How will you know what's running behind it? And then I was like, what if there is a way to know what technology is actually running the GraphQL server? And there's a web application firewall fingerprinting tool called WAF, which basically sends malicious payloads at web application firewalls, looks at the responses, and determines which web application firewall is behind that WAF. And I was like, maybe that could actually translate to GraphQL. And it actually did. We developed a tool called GraphWolf.
That's cool.
And GraphWolf sends like a mix of benign and not benign queries at a GraphQL API. And based on the responses, it will be able to determine if it's like a Java GraphQL or a Python GraphQL or a Rust GraphQL. And that was actually quite nice because there wasn't a way to actually fingerprint GraphQL APIs at the time. So having that ability to write a book, but also develop new tools that didn't exist at the time was a really great combination and experience, because we were able to not just contribute the book as a learning resource, but the actual offensive security tools. So most of the tools in the book were actually written by us, and a bunch of others that were not, like Nmap, for example. So that was a really cool experience, in my opinion.
Has this opened up more doors for you? I mean, your visibility in the community has been raised a lot by writing these books?
I would say so, especially companies that have started developing like GraphQL tools, either came for like to consult on like security matters, or even like meetups that wanted us to come and talk on the GraphQL security topic. So short answer is yes.
One of the best things that I've personally experienced after writing the book is having, bug bounty researchers or just junior hackers reach out and say like, oh my God, this book like paid for itself and some. Thank you so much for writing a book that sort of helped me get a bunch of bounties on HackerOne and BugCrowd and some of the other platforms. And so getting just like one person was really like one of the number one goals of like writing a book, is just helping one person. But to see the tremendous amount of support and love, I think Tripwire recently did a book club review on the book, and they seem to really like it, and they're excited for the second one, Black Hat Bash. We just want to, we both Dolev and I firmly believe that the more hackers that you have in a community, the safer those digital systems are going to be. And so when we can really promote a hacker mindset through our books, we know that inevitably that's going to trickle down into more secure systems. Because at the end of the day, hackers are the immunity to a lot of these problems that we have.
So guys, GraphQL is not as well known as Bash, I think, for a lot of people out there. Like, who developed this? I know you cover the stuff in the introduction to the book, but just for everyone who's watching, who developed it? Why was it developed? Why do I care, basically?
GraphQL, what is it? Who made it? So GraphQL is a query language that was originally developed by Facebook, and it's a query language primarily for APIs. And most folks are familiar with like SOAP or REST-based API technologies. And what GraphQL was developed for was primarily to solve the problem with underfetching and overfetching, primarily with like REST APIs. And that's when you've got multiple different endpoints and you want to structure a UI element on your front ends. And maybe you have to make a couple of requests in order to get the user profiles and the location information, or even some of the pet information. With REST, you have to make maybe 3 or 4 calls, and some of the API endpoints might return a lot more data than you actually need. Whereas with GraphQL, you can just make one request to the GraphQL endpoint and structure your query in a way that gives you all the information that you want the way you want it. And with one request, you get everything that you need, populating information about the user, the pets, or the location information that you need for your UI. One of the things that I also want to talk about is how GraphQL has put a lot of power in the hands of the client or the API consumer. And this amount of flexibility and enablement is really great for developers, especially like front-end developers looking to interact with an API. That's why a lot of development shops and a lot of big companies like Atlassian, GitHub, and PayPal have all been really adopting GraphQL recently, because it's helped speed up a lot of the performance and some of the development time for interacting with their APIs. But this power that GraphQL gives to its consumers and its clients are really what leads to a lot of these security weaknesses and downfalls. And that's what the book really talks about in detail, are all the different ways you can structure a client sort of request to an API to cause havoc at that API server level.
Okay, I'll just say that some of the design decisions behind how GraphQL queries a server really introduces a lot of security issues and new things that we haven't dealt with before. There's like a single endpoint to query a GraphQL server. There's no like, API v1 users or API v1 accounts or something like that. It's all typically a single endpoint. And the intent of the client is all based on the payload that is sent, which changes a lot of things. For example, web application firewalls, like rate limiting and things like that, don't really typically look at these types of things. They tend to look at for example, the method, the HTTP method that you use. If it's a GET, maybe somebody's just requesting data. If it's a POST, maybe somebody's updating data or adding data. And GraphQL changes that perspective. So it's like mostly POST and a single endpoint. So how do you know what a client is actually doing? If you look at access logs as an example, all you will see is like a bunch of posts, and the path is going to be /GraphQL. So how do you know what the client is doing? So you have to really inspect the actual payload that's coming in to know what the client is actually trying to do. And Nick mentioned that you can actually request or build a single HTTP request containing multiple queries. That's also not something that is very RESTy, as an example. So a lot of these fundamental changes really introduces new security gaps in tools, not just offensive tools, but also defensive tools. So that really is a big difference between like REST and GraphQL.
Yeah, one other thing that I wanted to jump in and share as well, which is what Dolev and I were able to do a lot of research into, is that there's many different implementations of GraphQL. So Facebook wrote the specification on, how a GraphQL API should work, and then they also released the GraphQL JS sort of implementation library as a part of it. But there's no particular language. You don't have to use JavaScript to write a GraphQL API server. They just wrote a specification that says, if you follow this, then you've pretty much built a GraphQL API. Well, as a part of one of the projects that we talked about in the book, the GraphQL threat matrix, we've actually stack ranked all the different GraphQL implementations and how good or bad they are in regards to some of their compliance with the spec and what validations they may have enabled, which ones they don't. And this can lead to a lot of really interesting attack vectors as well. So some folks follow the spec very closely, others don't. And that's something that we also talk about in the book, is some of those implementation issues that you might uncover when you do sniff out and fingerprint a particular GraphQL server.
It was developed in Facebook was it in your book? You said 2012, right? And then 2015?
2015 it was released
as open source. So is it only in the last few years that this has really taken off? Or
I would say starting from 2000, I would say 2020, I started to see more of it. And we started getting more pentesters coming and asking questions about GraphQL. And it was, for pentesters, it's really bizarre to see a GraphQL API because it's not like anything they've ever seen before. And some people are, kind of thrown off by it because it's new and they have no idea what they're seeing. Which was interesting because when we talk to pentesters, they do say, hey, yeah, we run into more GraphQL APIs. For example, HackerOne is all GraphQL for the most part. Whatever populistic UI is mostly GraphQL. GitHub, GitLab, Shopify, a lot of well-known, platforms, Magento, for example, as well. So you start seeing it more and more. And typically in the industry, when you see the big players doing something or choosing a specific technology, you see a lot of other companies starting to wonder, oh, maybe they know something that we don't. Maybe we should pick that up and it'll make us better, I'm sure. So we do see that more and more. I'm not entirely sure that it's going to be as popular as REST, though. I do think that it has specific use cases, but it also has a lot of challenges. I'm not sure that it's going to be become suddenly more popular, but you will see it more and more.
So I'm just thinking for someone who wants to learn this, do they have to read Corey's book first, Hacking APIs, or can they go straight to this? Is it better, what's the path?
No, I don't think that they need to read Hacking APIs. However, it would be a great book to read to get a good foundational understanding of how APIs work and the different tools that are available. But we wrote Black Hat GraphQL in a way that really takes someone from zero knowledge of what GraphQL is all the way up to full expert mode where You can fingerprint a GraphQL server and find particular weaknesses and know exactly how GraphQL works and how to structure its query as a result of it. So no need to go back, but I will say that it's a great sort of foundational resource for folks who really want to learn more about API hacking in general.
Here's the book that Corey wrote. I highly recommend this book, and I've got links below where I interviewed Corey as well. The one thing I did notice when I read your book is that you guys do refer to the differences between GraphQL and REST. So I'm assuming you have to at least have some kind of foundational knowledge about REST before you get here, right?
I think it makes sense to have some REST knowledge. I think picking up GraphQL as the first API to learn, I wouldn't necessarily do that. I think as a person that is starting, you want to learn things that are very known and popular, so it transfers well to whatever you're trying to do. If it's a job that you want to find, it's very likely that they will use REST over GraphQL unless you're looking at jobs at, I don't know, Shopify or GitLab or something. But I do think that starting with Corey's book makes sense. You don't have to, but it does make sense. It will also really highlight the differences between attacking a REST API versus attacking a GraphQL API. We do give a lot of examples and try to compare the two in the book. But I think it will make it easier for the reader if they come with some REST API knowledge.
But from like a jobs point of view, there's a lot of opportunities, right? Because APIs are everywhere. A lot of them are vulnerable. I mean, if you were starting today, would you seriously look at APIs as a place to start in pen testing?
Absolutely.
Yes, 100%. I think every single modern technology out there uses some form of an API, either directly or indirectly. And as Corey sort of mentions, APIs are the sort of the crown jewels of an organization. It's where all the data lives. It's where all the core functionality tends to also live as well for some of these web applications and SaaS providers. So APIs are probably one of the best places for a junior penetration tester or a bug bounty researcher to really hone in their craft and figure out how an API works, what to expect, what the status codes mean, versus a 200 or a 4 or a 3, how to authenticate, how to authorize to an API, how to use things like Postman. And I know as part of your session last time with Corey, Corey went through a fantastic demo of how to break into the...
We've got to get you guys back for demos.
Yeah, we're definitely going to do doing a demo of the damn vulnerable GraphQL application. And I think, showing off how with a single request, you can cause an entire server to crash will really resonate with folks about the power that they wield by being an API client with GraphQL. So I think it would be a really great demo.
Dolev, I saw one of your videos on YouTube where you were demonstrating. It's quite an older one, I think, but you're using a WordPress site and you were just nesting queries or something, and it whacked that server. It killed SQL and WordPress.
It's actually specifically WordPress is interesting because a plugin that can impact the core of WordPress is usually an interesting vulnerability. Still denial of service, but it's very effective. But what's interesting about GraphQL is that you have more than one way to DOS a server and take it down, because the queries that you compose can be very complex. That translates to very complex SQL queries. So if you're running on a single server or something and you don't have a lot of resources, it's going to be very easy to take it down. It's interesting and funny because when Nick and I were in the midst of writing a book, we also had a kind of a bug bounty session together to try and see how many vulnerable GraphQL servers out there to a particular vulnerability that we found and is covered in the book. And I think that funded half of Nick's wedding or something. That was a fun experiment.
So the vulnerability that Dolev mentioned is directive overloading, and it in fact is a 0-day vulnerability that we had found in the GraphQL specification itself. This is where you append a lot of directives, which is a fancy way for another sort of request that you send to a GraphQL API to modify how the GraphQL server responds to it. So for instance, if I send in a request get me my full name, and my full name comes back and it's sort of Nick Aleks, but capital N and a capital A for first and last name. But if I wanted to have the server respond and have everything capitalized, sometimes with REST, you would have to do that on the front end to capitalize all of the data that you get back from the API. But you can actually append a directive that says something like capitalize and put that next to the full name field. And then you get back from the server in all caps, Nick Aleks. Now, this concept of a directive, you can append a lot of those directives over and over and over and over and over again on a particular field. And the way that GraphQL handles multiple different directives isn't very graceful. And some of the controls, rate limiting controls that GraphQL puts in place don't actually prevent an attack like this from taking down a server. So this one particular zero-day vulnerability that we found in the GraphQL spec impacts every single implementation of GraphQL. So we just had to go out there and do a couple of bug bounty hunts on folks who are using GraphQL.
I remember when we wanted to disclose this, we had some interesting conversations with maintainers of different implementations of GraphQL. And some of them were like, that's on the user that's on them to protect themselves, as opposed to let's fix it on the server side, which was an interesting take. And a lot of the GraphQL vulnerabilities are not something that you typically you would get protections for on the server side. It would be expected that you run some kind of a WAF or a gateway that will protect you from that. But for a small shop that is using GraphQL, they're not going to bother with it. But it was an interesting conversation to have. Where they're like, that's on the client, that's not on us. And in fact, the actual GraphQL specification, which is sort of like an RFC, doesn't even mention security, because security is not part of what it's about. It's more like, if you want to build a GraphQL server, these are the things you want to validate for, these are the things you want to support. There is no how do you protect against certain things, which is interesting in general. But yeah, it was a great experience overall, and we're happy to start a new chapter with Black Hat Bash now, which is completely different to GraphQL. It's not a niche, and it has been around for so long, as opposed to GraphQL. It's a niche and it's new. So that's definitely a new experience.
But let me see if I got this right. You guys started writing the book. During the writing of the book, you discovered a 0-day. You used bug bounty to fund your wedding, Nick, or part of your wedding. Is that right?
Yep, that's correct.
So what a good reason to write a book, right?
Yep. Weddings are definitely not cheap.
I love that. So, I think this, so, when you guys are talking about this, it makes me worry that there's a lot of vulnerabilities in GraphQL. But, I'm assuming that the advantages of it outweighs the disadvantages.
Yes. I think that for the most part, if you run GraphQL at scale, it's going to be very hard to cause denial of service, for example, which is probably, if not the most popular, second most popular vulnerability in GraphQL, authorization being probably the first. The authorization part is actually interesting. You can implement authorization in many different ways. And since graphs can be very complex, the authorization can get complex as well. So I wouldn't say that the security issues are so bad that you shouldn't use it. I think that you should just be aware that denial of service and authorization are two very, very common problems. You should just make sure that you know how to deal with them. We've worked, like I said, we worked at a fintech company, and they were all over it. They were super invested in it. Everybody had to learn it. And they have as far as I know, no plans to move away from it. But typically you would have, it's not only GraphQL or REST, sometimes they work together. It's very common, design pattern, to have a GraphQL server or a GraphQL API being the first kind of interface, and it's actually interacting with REST APIs internally. So it's a graph and combination of REST APIs.
Yeah.
So it's also common to have a hybrid model of GraphQL and REST together.
But I love what you guys are saying, because if I'm a pen tester or I'm doing bug bounty, there seems to be a lot of opportunities here.
Yes. Especially since pen testers see it and they're not really sure what they're looking at when they first see a GraphQL API.
Yeah.
I do think that there's still a lot of uncovered vulnerabilities in the bug bounty space, in the bug bounty programs. Once you find a niche in general in bug bounty and you dive into it, you increase your chances to find vulnerabilities, as opposed to doing mile wide, inch deep type of scanning and attacks. once you dive into a particular area, you will have more chances because most people are not going to go that deep. And GraphQL is an example of that, I think. And we saw that once we found something that wasn't super known, wasn't known at all, actually, we then kind of did this sweep across all the common bug bounty programs that run GraphQL, and we started reporting it that night. And, for example, Adobe, which I think acquired Magento. Magento is an e-commerce platform. Paid us, for example. GitHub paid us. I think there's a bunch of Atlassian paid us. Even I'm not sure if Jira and Confluence use GraphQL, but Atlassian in general use GraphQL. I think they have parts in their ecosystem that uses GraphQL. And I think a bunch of other companies also paid. Some, denial of service is actually one of those vulnerability categories that is not paid high amounts of bounties in general in bug bounty programs. But since in GraphQL it's so easy to take a server down or at least exhaust it, maybe it's more severe than just like a REST type of denial of service.
I love that because, I was just going to ask you guys, what are the two places to focus? And if I remember correctly, it would be denial of service and authentication, right? Those are the two.
Yeah, authorization. Yeah.
Authorization. Yeah. Mainly because of how the graph in GraphQL works. You've got different nodes and edges. A node is sort of similar to like a property or an object, and an edge is a relationship. And so let's say you have access to query all of the pets in a pet store API. But you can't really query, the users. You can maybe only query your own user account. The way that the relationship between pets and users in the platform might be related to a point where a user can have a bunch of pets associated with them. But if you have access to view all the pets, you can maybe even run a query for who is this person's owner and indirectly get access to that user's data within the GraphQL API. So there's definitely a lot of authorization issues. Now, I think GraphQL recommends that authentication and authorization not be dealt within the GraphQL layer. They sort of mention do authentication before GraphQL and then do authorization at your business logic layer. But not a lot of folks will sort of read that, understand it, or implement it properly, and they'll do authentication and authorization within their GraphQL layer. And so if you're a bug bounty researcher or a pen tester, and you see things like authentication or authorization logic living within the GraphQL layer itself, pay close attention to it because there's probably going to be some issues there.
So I wanted to ask you, if I read this book, as let's say I'm interested now, and I read this book, I think you've mentioned it, Nick. The people who've read this book and then gone out there have made much more money. The ROI on this has been amazing, right? Because if I spend the time, I study this, there's a lot of opportunities to make money from this, right?
Yes, yeah, 100%. I think the combination of the book being really hands-on, it teaches you what GraphQL is from zero to hero, and the fact that GraphQL security isn't well understood or adopted currently in the industry, and a lot of organizations are adopting GraphQL to be sort of their primary API interface. That combination should provide folks with an amazing amount of bounties if they're able to find GraphQL APIs as a part of some of their bug bounty programs that they're a part of. I'm very confident that this book will help you find some bounties.
Yeah, I'll just mention that I think at DEF CON, a pretty young guy reached out to us and I think talked about how the book helped him get a serious bounty. I'm not sure if I remember the amount, maybe Nick, but he was really happy because that book gave him the edge over others to find that vulnerability. I think it was part of like one of those HackerOne type of hacking sessions.
Yeah, Lupin.
I'm not sure. Nick will probably be able to correct me on that, but I think he reached out to us because it made him a lot of money.
Yeah, so he goes by 0x Lupin on X. When he found out that we were at DEF CON, he's like, Nick, I just need to meet you. I need you to get to sign the book for me. Because I think it was like over $50,000 that he was able to get in bounties in just a short period of time, just by looking at the book and using it as a part of his bug bounties that he's a part of. He's also taken a step forward, and I think he's also doing some additional GraphQL security research. And I think that's giving him some additional bounties as well. So shout out to Lupin for continuing to do a huge investment in GraphQL security research. And by all means, like the book is probably not going to find all the different vulnerabilities and 0 days and ways for you to break into a GraphQL API, but it should give you a good baseline foundation for the common vulnerabilities you would find, how to use and interact with GraphQL APIs. And from there, you could potentially find a couple of other 0 days that definitely impact the spec and make a pretty coin after that.
I'm amazed you guys are talking like about 0 days as if they common, because I think in other technologies it's very hard, right?
Yeah, I mean, the more eyes on a specific technology, the more likely it's going to be robust. But there are exceptions to it. I mean, in Bash, a vulnerability was found, and Bash is, I don't know, maybe older than me at this point.
Yeah.
Probably older than me. So the fact that there are a lot of eyes on the technology does not mean necessarily that there's not going to be loopholes there. Shell shock in 2014, for example. So, I mean, it just increases the chances. And I think since GraphQL is a niche technology, there's just higher chances of you finding something there. We do see pen testing firms that specialize in like advanced web application pen testing using the book to provide more value to their customers because they see that more of their customers are running GraphQL and their knowledge is more focused on REST. We've seen that with many pen testing firms, including ones that are based out of Toronto, for example. So that was an interesting one as well. I also heard of a firm that uses the book as a giveaway for candidates who interview with them, and they need to go through some kind of an interview lab. They give that as a gift for somebody who's interviewing with them, as a way to say thank you for being part of the process. So we've seen a different use of the book, which is kind of fun.
Maybe a little bit of advice for folks looking to find like a loophole or 0 day in GraphQL or any technology really, and you might have like limited knowledge in coding or hacking, is to just simply read some of these specification files or RFCs. And this will just allow you to get a good understanding of how the technology works. And as you read these specification files or RFCs, always keep in the back of your mind questions of like, what if? So the specification says, hey, ensure that fragments can't relate to each other or cannot reference one another. Because if you do, you can get into a fragment cycle DDoS attack. And if you ask the question, okay, well, what if they could? And what if some implementations don't actually check for that? That's exactly how you would find a CVE as you sort of check certain implementations of GraphQL. I think that's a really great way of finding novel vulnerabilities in technologies, is just reference the specification, read through it. I know it might be a really boring read, but you can find some really good golden gems and nuggets in there that could really be a huge return on investment.
I think the key sentence from what Nick said here is, if you say to yourself, what if this will work? We'll typically challenge what you're trying to do and challenge the application, and you may be surprised that what you thought may not work will actually work. So I think that's the key to pen testing and research in general. Just ask yourself, what if what I'll try to do here will actually end up working for me? Because you always assume that somebody has tested this. It's right there. So if I operate in like a program of like GitHub, and there's like 1,000 researchers that poke holes in GitLab or GitHub every month, maybe more, you assume that the things that are just popping out right away, somebody may have tested it already. So I'm just not going to bother and move on to the next thing. So that's a lot of like vulnerabilities were found that way. Like the things that you would expect somebody to would have picked up already, nobody actually looked at it, or maybe it has changed at some point, and it was tested yesterday, it was fine, a change was made, and now that functionality is no longer working correctly. That's also a part of pen testing, right? The continuous pen testing aspect, where things change. People, companies deploy changes multiple times a day. So whatever was tested yesterday may no longer be relevant today. So that automation piece is also critical. If you can automate your tests against programs, you already have an edge over other people that don't necessarily know how to automate things, and they mostly rely on manual tests. which we're hoping that Bash will help people put together tools in order to scan things without knowing a lot of programming in general, just knowing basic like scripting and how to kind of tie tools together to produce the desired result.
Yeah. Maybe like one other thing, like piece of advice for bug bounty researchers or pen testers looking to really make a splash is after you've found this sort of juicy nugget of a vulnerability, as Dolev mentioned, like automating the detection piece and the continuous testing is like really great to really scale your bounty returns. And so looking at tools like Nuclei from Project Discovery, if you can write a Nuclei template that you can use to sort of scan all of the bug bounty programs that you're a part of, that's one really great way to figure out which bounties are potentially out there for reward by just having one little YAML file that you develop that's been custom researched and developed by yourself. That's a really great way to like maximize your return rather than having to manually go and run these checks. I think that's also a great segue, Dolev, over to the Black Hat Bash piece. I just had to mention Nuclei because it's such a great tool for codifying that detection piece.
You guys have mentioned the labs in the books, and I mean, both of them are very practical, allow you to do labs. Question is always, what do I need to run the labs? Do I need a very powerful laptop? How the lab set up? Is it a VM, Docker? How does it work?
Yeah. So for the Black Hat GraphQL one is actually very simple. You can run it on Docker, or you can run it just like a Python, like any Python application on your machine. We packaged it in a way that is very easy to deploy. You don't really have to do a whole lot. You just need to have Docker, and you run a single command, and it pulls the image and it deploys it, and the application is then running. What's nice about the then vulnerable GraphQL application is that if you managed to create some kind of a bug there and it's no longer working, it has a built-in mechanism to restore itself, like restore to last known good type of thing. And that's really helpful because when you start injecting things, you may kind of mess up the UI in certain ways, or you may put like a JavaScript there that will execute like cross-site scripting or like alert boxes all the time. You can just click on restore and it will restore everything back to the original state. So that was really helpful. So you don't need a powerful machine for this at all, especially the GraphQL one. In the Black Hat Bash book, we wanted to create, as Nick mentioned, almost like a network of a hosting company. How would a hosting company network look like? They'll probably have some databases. They'll probably have some applications. They may have some monitoring tools, maybe some caching mechanisms like Redis. But at the same time, we had to sort of balance that with what if we have somebody with a very old laptop who wants to run this? So we had to keep it pretty lean. So when you deploy the lab and you follow the book, you have two paths, essentially. You can install it, command by command manually, so you can kind of get experience how to run those commands, see what's going to be installed, try it for yourself. And then you have the fast track or the shortcut where you just run a script that does all the provisioning for you. You don't need a powerful machine for that either. We're running, I think, 7 containers, and those 7 containers are pretty slim in general. You just need a fair internet connection so you can do that timely and not take forever to download all these images. But in general, in terms of memory and disk, not so much. We also wanted to simplify the complexity there as much as possible because things tend to break. Operating systems change. Packages are removed by default sometimes. Default packages that you expect to have suddenly are no longer there. So we did want to rely on technologies that are less likely to change over time. So you don't need a powerful machine for either of them. We do recommend to run everything in a VM as opposed to your own machine.
Yeah.
We typically rely on Kali as like the base operating system.
I was going to say, you've got Kali in both of them, right?
We typically recommend to run Kali just because it's like well known and you can use other tools there maybe that you feel like during your experiments with the book. But you can most certainly run it on your computer as well. So your base operating system would be some VM. It could be Ubuntu, it could be Debian, Kali, whatever. And then we will deploy or help you deploy the lab using Docker Compose with a bunch of containers. And both books will actually guide you exactly how to open the browser to open up the specific machines that you're going to be attacking, which IP addresses, what those IP addresses are, what services are running there. So that the lab really guides you through the lab, the structure of it, how are the two networks kind of relate to one another. We wanted to give the feel that you're testing a company or like a hosting company from like an external perspective. And then you have like internal machines that are not really exposed to you until you actually take over one of those machines that are publicly facing, essentially. So we wanted to do all of that with as little complexity as possible.
I'm assuming one of the reasons you're using Docker is these are self-contained containers. So if something does get removed from like the Kali repository, it doesn't affect the lab that I'm using.
Correct. Yes. We also, as a kind of a safety mechanism, we have a pipeline that actually tests our lab every few days. If something breaks, we will know. The book uses the GitHub repository, a public GitHub repository. So if something does break, we will always be able to fix it. So we will try to maintain that lab for as long as possible. But inevitably, technologies change, things change. Books don't last years, but we did try our best to make sure that they do last for a little while.
I'm glad you've done that, because one of the biggest hurdles I think for a lot of people studying is if the lab doesn't work, it's such a struggle. So I'm glad you guys have spent so much time doing that, because I want to spend time learning the technology, not troubleshooting the lab.
And that's a really important point, because and that's where you kind of have to balance. You don't want readers to start troubleshooting and deploying everything themselves. You want to do it for them, but that's where you introduce that risk of automating it for them.
Yeah.
Whereas as you could go on a different path where you just give them the link to the technology, they will go and start installing it manually based on the latest up-to-date instructions. But that means they'll have to do those extra steps and maybe struggle there. So it's really two paths. Each one has, their pros and cons. But we did try to kind of balance that in the middle, where you have a script that if you want to use it and take that shortcut, but we also give you the manual steps. And if something changes, we can always update the script, and then that script will work if the manual steps are no longer working, right? Because once that's printed, it's done. If that link changes, if some step is removed or added, then that book, at least that page in the book, is no longer accurate. So we did want to leave that opportunity, or have that opportunity, to introduce a fix.
I'm assuming the book's for beginners. So you correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm a beginner, I want to, stuff like that can really throw you in your studies. So like, first question, is the book for beginners? What kind of prerequisite knowledge do I have for the Bash book?
Yeah, the book is definitely curated for beginners. Now, some of the number one books that I see that are recommended are like Black Hat Python, and that book is really great, and it's been written in a way that allows for folks to really understand how to hack into systems. And as part of Black Hat Bash, we wanted to really make this beginner-friendly book. So everything from the start, we teach you about what Bash is, how to get comfortable inside of a Bash shell, how to write some particular scripts, such as loops and use variables, and really give you the basics of how to do some automated shell scripting. From there, we built out 7 different containers with all different variations of vulnerabilities and ways to pop a shell inside of these environments.
Nice.
Everything from really basic web shells that you would use, or a reverse shell, or a particular vulnerability that you can exploit and scan for using Bash. So we really wrote this book for those folks who are junior penetration testers who want to get a good foundation when it comes to hacking. And Bash is one of those amazing scripting languages that most folks who are operating in this field will touch a Linux operating system and will inevitably see a Bash script here or there. And so getting really comfortable with your Bash foo skills is, I think, a really core competency in this space, in this industry. And Black Hat Bash, I think, hopefully does a really good job with giving folks, especially junior penetration testers, security engineers, sysadmins, a really great sort of introductory course to how Bash can be used to break into systems.
I love that, because The problem with learning like a language, Python or Bash or whatever, is I'm not learning that for the sake of learning that. I'm learning that to accomplish a goal. And there's no better way to learn like Bash or whatever than to have something exciting like this where you can, break into something.
Yeah, we also
Yeah.
in the Black Hat Bash book, we put together scripts, but we go about that in phases. Where you, like Nick mentioned, we teach the real basics, the fundamentals, the loops, the variables, and so on, and then we kind of describe a scenario or an objective that we want to achieve. For example, discovering when a new host is suddenly online on some internal network. So you write some tool that keeps probing the network once the host was found. It will send an email or something, but it won't send it twice, for example. So building or teaching the reader that knowledge or the basics to think like a programmer, like how would you build something efficiently and with as less tools as possible. But at the same time, Bash also relies on, calling some external tools, for example. So we do highlight when you actually need to call some additional tools, for example. But we do try to stress the importance of living off the land. So for example, if you want to run ifconfig or IP space A to see the network interface, maybe those tools don't exist. How do you know what the IP addresses are? Yeah. So we actually highlight specific files in the file system that will give you that information so that you can actually know the basic information without those tools. And we try to do that wherever possible. And one thing that is really exciting about the book is that it has, I think, almost 30 different exercises, hands-on exercises.
Nice.
And each exercise has like a sort of a pattern. Like, for example, we want you to go search the internet for something or pull some information, parse it, and then do something with it. So we walk you through like the general thought process around going about building something like this, and also provide the actual solution. And of course, the solution can be written in more than one way. So we highlight that, hey, you can get the full solution here if you want it, just to get like a shortcut to see how that program would look like. But we guide them how to run that thing, basically build that thing and run that thing themselves. And we try to come up with various scenarios that basically ended up with almost 30 different exercises in the book, which is really exciting. And I think that kind of working on that, planning how to plan for writing a script is very important, because it's like a thought process that you have to learn. And I really think that this book really stresses that importance as well. So I'm really hopeful that this book will not just be relevant and interesting to newcomers, but will also help maybe more advanced pentesters who want to learn a little bit about more the internal Linux stuff. So there's something for everybody.
Yeah. I'm glad you highlighted that. I mean, I always see it with people like yourselves who are very experienced. There's a difference between someone who can just use a tool and someone who can write their own tools.
Yeah, 100%. And one thing that we did in Black Hat GraphQL, as well as Bash, is when we ask them to use some tool, we try to highlight what the tool is actually doing and how it's doing it, so that they understand the concepts of it. So for example, if a tool is written in Ruby or something, or even Perl, what is the tool actually doing? How does it come up with this output in the first place? And we try to highlight those areas where the tool is like enumerating like packages in the file system, for example, or enumerating the available disks or files with certain loose permissions and things like that. So we do try to teach them how the tool is actually working, and not just to guide them to just blindly run the tool.
Yeah, I'd say that for folks who are like picking up the copy of the book and going through it, the same way that the lab is deployed, we kind of have the step-by-step process of how to do it, and that'll really teach you how to deploy the lab. But at the very end, we give you sort of like the answer, which is just run this script to do so. That approach is also with each of the exercises that Dolev mentioned. So I highly stress that folks don't just go to the end of that particular exercise and read through the script and then just like copy and paste it and then pop the shell and continue. Really maybe cover that page and do your best to like write your script as best as possible to really accomplish the task at hand. So try to not go right to those spoilers. I know with like, for instance, with DVGA, you can go off and like, look at a solution for a particular challenge and just follow through. And that's one way to learn. But I think when you really stretch yourself and pressure test yourself, you'll actually be surprised at, maybe how close you were to the actual bash script at the end of the chapter. So some of the other things that I wanted to talk about as well is that the book and the lab for Black Hat Bash is incremental. So as you slowly learn about Bash and some of the scripts that you can write to do some reconnaissance, maybe do some vulnerability scanning, get some initial access and pop some initial shells into some of these containers, you'll notice that, oh, I'm not a root account in this particular environment. I'm a very low privileged account. I can't really do much. And so if you follow the book, it's very much like a really graceful storyline of how some of the biggest compromises and breaches in cybersecurity have happened. And I think that exhilaration that most hackers have when they first pop a shell in an environment is something that we want to give these readers who do deploy the book and the lab, and can really feel that exhilaration of landing a shell in an environment that is not your own computer, and being able to do that in a safe and contained and isolated environment that you run yourself will really give you that experience and that confidence with being able to do enterprise level penetration tests in environments that are going to be very similar in a sense to some of these containers where they will be locked down, where you won't have all the tools that you would potentially have at your disposal in some of your playground or some of your other sandbox environments.
I love that. I mean, I think I'm glad you highlighted that it's not just for beginners. Like when I saw the introductory, I just skimmed through that because it's stuff I know already. So someone who knows more can just go to the more advanced stuff later in the book, right?
Yep. You can use the book like a reference guide, or you can use it as like a cover to cover read. For those folks who are getting, just into hacking and penetration testing, I'd highly recommend that you read the book cover to cover and follow all the exercises along the way. But if you are more of an advanced penetration tester and a hacker, you really want to hone in on some of your skills, whether it's defense evasion or privilege escalation, using just things like Bash and some of the binaries that live on some of these Linux systems, then go to those chapters, find those scripts, maybe add those scripts to your own little red teamers repository of useful Bash scripts. There's a lot of like information discovery and data collection scripts that are there that I know for a fact will be useful. So the next time you pop a shell in an environment, check out the repository, take a look at the book, and maybe some of these scripts will help automate some of those mundane manual tasks that you often run on a continuous basis with some of your penetration tests.
Yeah. So one thing for me is, I think other than the hacking part of the book, one thing that is, I think people will take after reading the book is how to customize their environment to their liking. I think one thing that sets apart more advanced pen testers is how some of them, at least, have very highly customized advanced processes and workflows that can give them that edge to find things faster than others. They may run the same tools, but in order to run an enumeration scan, get DNSs, and then scan those DNSs, and then all of that requires all sorts of tools. And one problem that we have in the offensive security side of things is that tools do not produce necessarily the same type of output, whether it's format or some other. Yeah. And in order to tie them all back to one desired format requires a lot of knowledge and requires the ability to actually produce that kind of unified view of all these tools together. And I think that as you progress and advance as a penetration tester, you'll be developing a more customized environment for yourself that really fits your needs. And I think after reading that book, you'll be able to do that. Maybe setting aliases or writing a script that sources a bunch of other scripts that can call a variety of different scripts from one command and produce some result, as an example, as opposed to ad hoc running this tool and then that tool and then that tool and kind of analyzing the results separately and then putting it together and trying to make sense of it. And I think all these tasks can be highly automated. And I think that this book will give that knowledge. And I think that's the key, well, at least one of the keys, to develop a really great process of pen testing in general.
I think if you learn to code, right, or you learn to script, I mean, scripting is the way to start if you like, but coding just changes your world totally.
100%. And I think that, especially in the bug bounty space, take 1 million bug bounty researchers. Not all of them can code. So some of them may run surface level tools and analyze the results. Maybe they'll do this once a day or twice a day, depending how much time they spend there. But if you have a researcher that can actually automate it, they will just open up their Slack and wait for a notification when a vulnerability is found. And their tools will run all the time. Or the script will be intelligent enough to know when something has changed, and then it will run the scan. So you definitely get an edge when you start learning how to automate your processes. And if you want to be really good at this, then I think learning Bash is like the basics. But then you can go on to learn Python or Go or Rust. But I think Bash is like really the foundation.
So guys, perhaps you can give us one or two of the attacks that you most enjoyed creating that's part of this book.
I can give one example. In Vim, the text editor, there's like a little plugin that allows you to run commands as soon as the user saves a document. So when you save a file, there's some kind of a postscript that will run. And there's a scenario in the book where you can sort of hijack or copy the content and do something with it as soon as the user saved that text file, which I found it to be pretty fun. And an interesting component in Vim Vim is is an ecosystem of things, really. It's super complex in terms of like the plugins and the additions that you can add to it. But I found that pretty fun. One other thing that I thought was fun is that there's an exercise where you hook, basically, essentially the terminal. Whenever a user hits enter, there's going to be a postscript that will run and give you the actual input of the user, like what the user actually typed and executed, and then you can do something with it. So for example, there is an exercise where you have some logic that looks for credentials or looks for tools that tend to pass credentials in the parameters, like MySQL, for example, or Redis, and it will look for patterns of those tools to see if somebody passed the credentials, and it will collect them and send them to some server, which I found pretty fun as well.
That's great. Nick, come on, you got to give us one.
The exercise that I absolutely love, because I'm sure a lot of pen testers and bug bounty researchers hate having to deal with web shells. So when you upload a web shell into a server and you are able to have some really crude web-based interface into an environment, that formatting, the encoding, it's all kind of garbage usually, and it's hard to really work in an environment like that. So in one of the exercises, after you've already uploaded a web shell, you have this opportunity to write a little tiny bash script that'll continuously run interactively that will, as you run a command like who am I or ls or catting particular files, it will send a curl request to your web shell and bring back the sort of really nice encoded response back into your little bash shell environment. So as you're running these commands, you're really feeling like you're in that environment rather than having to interact with it through a web page and having to click a button to click submit, etc. There are things like that that are really like great quality of life improvement scripts that I think are a great reference for folks to use in like future pen tests.
I love that. You guys have obviously been doing this for a long time. I'm assuming that you've taken like some of the best stuff that you've learned over these years and you've put it into this book so that people can sort of shortcut the system, if you like, not have to go through like the long, arduous journey and kind of like get a step up.
Yes, but I'm a little bit torn on that. I do feel that people definitely need to learn the basics. Like it's okay to pick up a book and learn it. And you can definitely do that as one of the first things that you do when you start your career. But I feel that learning networks and learning systems, like just Linux, basic Linux, doesn't have to do anything with hacking, specifically, is so important and can help you so much in your career by understanding how networks work. Same thing with breaking applications. If you are a pen tester and you test web apps and you've never really built one, you won't appreciate how difficult it is to build something securely. I feel like, yes, you can pick up a book and learn the gist of things, but the basics are underrated and they are super important.
I love that answer. Nick, come on.
Yeah.
Give me an answer that refutes what I just said. Sorry, go on.
I'd say that Dolev and I have been hacking for a really, really long time. And when we first decided to write this book, we immediately wanted to lean back on some of the expert frameworks out there that the two of us have been using for pretty much every single one of our pen test engagements and security audits, which is things like the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And while we don't explicitly call it out as like a framework that we use to like actually write the book from cover to cover and all the different ways to gain initial access, escalate privileges, understanding some of these like really core resources like the MITRE ATT&CK framework and other foundational elements is like super, super important. But the way that we've sort of injected our knowledge and how we wrote the book and some of the useful tips that every hacker should know when executing some of these exercises throughout the attack kill chain, while it's in there, and folks who read the book will say like, oh wow, I'm looking at the MITRE ATT&CK framework and it's very similar. I would still highly recommend that folks still always look at that, because while it's Bash right now, you might be operating within a PowerShell environment and in a Windows environment tomorrow. So getting like a good breadth and exposure and base is going to be really, really important. And while Dolev and I always try to educate young hackers into how we approach targeting systems, the ways that we approach it are maybe eventually going to get old and not be relevant anymore. While we always strive to make our tools, our resources, and books as timeless as possible, sometimes going back to the basics, as I mentioned before, like reading the specification file and looking at documentation and how it's written is really how you find those really great novel zero-day vulnerabilities.
I think those were great answers, right? Because I think that's a problem a lot of people have. Give me the shortcut, but I think all of us have been in this game for a while, know that you have to put the work in.
Yeah. 100%. I think one of the nice thing about this is that we try to add like the newer type of tools, like the nuclei one, and putting emphasis on how to template attacks, how you can take a certain type of attack and then create a template out of it and then run it across a fleet of machines, as an example. And how you can use a tool like that. Maybe not avoiding the sense that you don't want to learn it, but it's a way to automate something without really knowing how to program. You can just write like some logic in the template that will do that for you. Yeah. But one thing that I found interesting is that everything that we did in the book had to have some Bash flavor, right? Had to have something to do with Bash, which is not an easy task, right? Because a lot of tools are, for example, how do you like make HTTP requests? In Python, maybe you would use like a requests library or something like that, right? Exactly, but in Bash, you would be using like you will wrap some tool essentially, right? You will either call curl, you can even make HTTP requests with netcat as an example, or ncat. And that adding that Bash flavor was actually not trivial sometimes. So we had to use some tools eventually, but in general, I think that there are a lot of scripting and automation done with the basic non-security focused tools that you'll typically find on a host, as well as bringing external tools as well that you would typically have on Kali as an example. So one thing that the book does is your launchpad for attacks is Kali, the Kali VM that runs all these containers, right? That would be like a Pentester laptop with all the tools, right? But once you hack the environment, that's when those tools are no longer available. We don't assume that you can just upload your tools like right away. We want to assume that you are not able to, and you need to make do with what's available on those hosts. And I think that's the fun part, because you do have that perspective where all the tools are available and the perspective that you have no tools available. And that was a fun way of creating or architecting this lab in a way that gives you both perspectives.
I like that. Nick, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I think that the book does its best to like blend the new with the old. And Bash, while being a fairly old scripting language, we do reference a lot of newer technologies like RESTScan, which is a super fast port scanner. It's really super efficient, and how you can interface that with Bash to automate and orchestrate some of your attacks is definitely in there and in the book. But as Dolev mentioned, a lot of pen test engagements and red teaming scenarios typically go wrong when a big, fat, clunky tool gets either downloaded or put into an environment, because then the blue team or some of the security monitors tend to go off and they say, oh, we found something that's known malicious in this environment. And then the red team gets sad because they got kicked off of the the host that they were just about to extract all the juicy information from. Really trying to move away from the tool-centric approach to hacking is what Dolev and I really wanted to accomplish with the book, but still give folks a little bit of a tidbit of like some of the latest, greatest modern tools that are out there, like Nuclei, Scan, etc. But some of the really great hackers are able to make do and MacGyver their way into a network or into a different neighboring server with just what they see around them. So that living off the land approach is really like a very CTF-y way of hacking, but then also doing so in a really stealthy and quiet way. And so, yeah, this book has something in it for those folks who want to go from being a really loud and tool-centric hacker with some of the sort of brute force attacks into a little bit more of a stealthy with a little bit of automation and orchestration element attached to it. So yeah, hopefully that gives a good round summary of like what the book is about and why we wrote it.
But I love what you guys have done, because it's not just reading a book, right? It's actually labs, and it's more like it's like a lab book almost. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, the lab is the foundation of the book, and it tells a story. As Nick mentioned, it's like a hosting company that manages networks or manages applications and databases of some customers, essentially. And those customers are at risk, and their data is at risk because the hosting company did not apply certain security best practices, and that's how we kind of find loopholes, and you gain access to their customers' data, essentially. And we try to tell that story in the book, and also keeping in mind the actual path an attacker would take. Nick mentioned the MITRE ATT&CK framework, where there's like a pretty clear path what an attacker would do from start to end. But sometimes you would go back and forth between stages. And the book also kind of highlights that. Like maybe you will recon, take over a machine, and then you'll recon again. So we also have that in mind. Like how would a reconnaissance look like when you're outside of a network versus when you're inside a network? Suddenly you're exposed to a new network, as an example. So we have containers that are dual homed, as an example. So once you take over that container, suddenly you see an internal network that wasn't exposed to you before. So we try to explain to the reader that not everything that you see from the outside is necessarily going to be the same inside. And some hosts are going to be exposed to new things, and some hosts are more restricted and hardened while others are not. I think that's the fun part about the lab.
And like all good stories in this lab environment, Dolev and I have put in some actual characters. So there are like fake employee accounts littered across the environment, and you'll come across certain names, and you'll sort of get a sense of, oh, this person might be a system administrator, or this person might be a developer. And as you go into some of these new containers and these new servers, you'll get a sense of, oh, what kind of commands have they run? And let me check out their history and see if I can get some of their credentials. So you're not only just compromising the containers per se, but you're also using Bash to like compromise the credentials that you're finding throughout this sort of story in this sort of environment that we've built.
Guys, my biggest disappointment, and I think a lot of people watching this, depending on when it goes live, will be very disappointed because the book's not available yet. So when is it going to be available?
So the book is going to be sent to the printers on June 17th, fingers crossed. So I think we'll start seeing it in people's hands probably July. The fun thing is when Black Hat GraphQL came out, when we figured out that it's out there when suddenly somebody uploaded on Twitter that they got the book before us. They actually got the book before us, so we didn't even know that it's already out there. But that's the target date. We wrapped up early access, the early access stage that has been going on for quite some time. The book is, from writing perspective, it's mostly done. So we really want to hold the book as well. So we're just as eager.
Now I'm looking forward to that. So just for everyone who's watching, they can go and register on the No Starch website, right? Or perhaps on Amazon, try and pre-order. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yep, you can go on the No Starch website and you pre-order the book. You can get the physical hard copy shipped over to you. And you can also get the early access version, which will give you a couple of chapters to play around with. And the entire repository is available for folks to download and play with if they kind of want to get a little bit of an early scoop into what the environment looks like. But definitely hold off and wait for the book to come before you go a little bit too deep into that environment.
So guys, tell me, can people reach out to you, and where can they get hold of you? Where's the best place? Is it Twitter, X as it's called these days, LinkedIn? Where's a good place?
All of the above, pretty much.
Yep, all the above. Mainly, X and LinkedIn are the best, and then GitHub as well.
That's great. I'll put those links below. So for everyone who's watching, I've only got like some of the chapters. What I've read is amazing. I've obviously got that's Bash. I've obviously got the GraphQL book. I was a bit nervous about this because I was like, oh, this is really complicated, something I don't know. But I mean, you guys have done a great job keeping it simple. And I love what you did in that book in the beginning. You kind of like gave the primer so people who were new to it could really understand what it was about. And I mean, you guys have done that in this interview, and I really appreciate you doing that. I always say to young people, jump on the new wave, right? Get on the new technology. That's how they can leapfrog us who've been around for a longer period of time. So highly recommend that book, highly recommend Bash. My biggest disappointment is that I can't get the book today, but I look forward to it being available. Any last words, guys, before we wrap up?
I want to say, big thank you, David. This is a true honor to be a part of the show, and what you do is really great. Let's inspire that next generation of hackers, and just say Dolev and I have definitely caught the book writing bug. So expect more from us.
Thank you so much.
Any hints about what's coming?
No, I'll just say thank you so much for me kind of sitting here talking to you. I'm like starstruck almost. So to be here is an absolute honor.
I really appreciate it, guys. But now you've hinted about a book. Can you kind of like give us hints? What you're thinking about? Or is that like top secret?
So I'm okay with talking about it. There's no like book deal whatsoever. I obviously want to work with No Starch again, but I'm doing a lot of research right now into drone hacking, and I'm currently working on a new project called Damn Vulnerable Drone. This is a simulated drone hacking environment, which will teach folks how to hack drones in a free and safe manner. Because right now, drone hacking is a little too expensive. You have to buy an actual drone and fly it around and then try hacking into it somehow. And you are successful and you operate it incorrectly, you might actually damage someone's car or hurt someone. So in a simulated environment that teaches you all the different steps and techniques on how to break into a drone was something that I was like, I got to do it. And so while I'm working on the Damn Vulnerable Drone application right now, and you can see it in my GitHub, I am going to be looking at writing a book in this space.
I look forward to that. I'm going to hold you to that.
On my end, I do have a 2026 contract with No Starch Press, where I'll write the practical DevSecOps book with No Starch.
Right.
Still 2 years from now, I'm going to be older than I am today. We'll see how I manage that with 2 kids and everything. But it'll happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I've always shied away from writing books, right? Because it's one of those things that feels like it's a lot of work, and the returns aren't always as great as financially, perhaps. But I really appreciate you guys doing this because I wish more people would write books because it's such a good way to share knowledge.
Yeah, I agree.
It's super rewarding, being able to have a book out there that really puts a stamp on a time in your life where you put a lot of research and energy and focus towards and is helping other folks with their careers and their journey is such a huge rewarding experience. So I highly recommend for those senior security engineers, Pentesters who have a lot of knowledge and experience in the space to really pick up, the possibility of writing a book. Now, Dolev and I have worked with No Starch. They have a really easy and clear way of how to put out a book proposal. They have a very clear template on their website you can fill out for that proposal process. It sounds a lot more daunting than it really is. I will say that it is extremely, extremely rewarding when you have a junior hacker or someone who comes up and has nothing but really great things to say about your book, and it's helped their careers grow. And I think in an industry like ours, where there is such a huge talent shortage and a huge gap, being able to write these books and give out some of the tools to folks and helping them learn the space is so important, especially in the cybersecurity industry.
Dolev, go for it.
I think I would totally encourage somebody to write a book if they have that in mind. I think the best opportunities are those that you're looking for something online, but it's not there. So it means that you needed it. there's a good chance somebody else needed it. And that's how you get to create something that produces value. I think in Corey Ball's example, like he wrote hacking APIs, but it started all from like personal notes. If I remember correctly, when I talked to him, it was all like personal notes. He had like 100 and something, pages of documentation on APIs. And then I think at some point when he started doing like API hacking, he was looking for books, but there weren't any. And it's actually surprising that hacking APIs was released like a year ago, but APIs have been around for a while. I'm surprised that there was no book prior to that. So he really, trailblazed the space with his book. But I'm sure that there was going to be more opportunities in the future, similar to GraphQL, right? It's a niche. There are going to be other niches as well. Just find that niche where there's not a lot of resources. You see that it's starting to pick up. That would be a good opportunity.
But I mean, I'm glad you guys wrote Black Hat Bash, right? Because it's like when I saw that, I said, this should have been written a long time ago. So I'm glad you guys did it.
Yeah. It was really great to be able to write that. If you have a second, David, I'm going to just bring up the damn vulnerable drone application here for you, so I can like give you a little sneak peek demo of that environment. So share screen. Okay, this is it. This is the damn vulnerable drone application. You can find it on my GitHub here. Yeah, the application has a simulated virtual environment where you are a hacker in this sort of airfield, and there is a drone right here, which is operated by this fellow right here, who's at the ground control station. And I wanted to give folks the ability to operate and fly through the different stages of a drone, like initializing the boot, and being able to see exactly how that firmware reacts in the environment. So as you initialize the boot, as you arm and take off the drone, as you sort of enable the autopilot, this gives you the ability as a hacker to then potentially run through exercises of, can I inject some packets into that network? Can I potentially go off and run some network scans on the companion computer on that particular drone? So in this environment, if you were to, let's say, take the drone and crash it, you can just easily go here and reset your entire simulated environment. There's a very simple and easy getting started guide, very much like the damn vulnerable GraphQL application. And it has a full featured architecture, how it breaks down all the components from the flight controller, the companion computer, the ground control station, the simulator, the different flight states, how you should use it, how you should not use it. And then from the attack scenario perspective, you can get a clear sense, almost like a MITRE attack framework, of like all the different ways you can hack into a drone. So you've got the reconnaissance techniques, the wireless attacking techniques, protocol tampering, denial of service, things like GPS jamming, geo squeezing. The entire framework is built off of the Ardu pilot, the common open source drone firmware that's out there, and also the Mavlink protocol, which is used to control micro air vehicles. And this environment allows you to essentially run through that entire stage. And I'm hoping that this will be a great learning resource, and it sort of gives folks some tips and tricks of things to do and things to look out for. I'm going to try to see if I can at least get the drone up here and flying for you. The demo gods allow it. The book will
be released next week, right?
This is going to be released as soon as possible. So if I can here, hopefully, if the drone gets a GPS lock on, so it does have a fake simulated GPS environment as well. The whole world of drones is like a really fascinating one with a lot of different moving components. And so we're just getting the position lock right now, and now the drone should be taking off.
I could learn to hack a DJI or some other well-known drone if I went through this, right?
Yeah, so the foundational guides of like how you would approach hacking a drone is all within the virtual environment. This one particularly focuses on the Ardu Pilot and Mavlink protocol, but some manufacturers have their own proprietary communication protocol. But this will teach you sort of the techniques and tactics on how to approach that. So here you can see I just enabled the autopilot flight mode, and I want to be able to teach people how to potentially inject a waypoint into that autopilot command. And so while the drone right now is flying in a circle as intended, if you were on your Kali Linux machine, you could potentially go into that Docker container of that drone and inject those commands. So just like DVGA, just like the Black Hat Bash environment, it's fully built out in a Dockerized environment. And I'm hoping to spread some light into the world of drone hacking in a safe and free way, rather than having to have folks buy a really expensive drone and crash it and feel like they can't invest in research in this area.
So guys, I really want to thank you for, writing these books and sharing your knowledge and not keeping it to yourself. I think that was always a problem with a lot of people in the past, perhaps, well, some people in the past where they kept the knowledge to themselves. I really want to thank you for, empowering the next generation. For everyone who's watching, put in the comments below. We've discussed doing demos. What demos would you like to see? Like specific hacking demos? Is it Bash, GraphQL? I think Bash would be really popular, but for everyone who's watching, please put your comments below. Guys, thanks so much for coming on and sharing. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, David.